So the next paper is offered by Steve Mason from University of Groningen, who is a distinguished professor of ancient Mediterranean and religions and cultures. He is famous for his edition of Josephus Flavius. Unfortunately, he cannot be here for some health problems, so the paper will be read by Kelly Koblenz-Bauch from St. Edward's University in Austin, and we are very privileged she is with us at the Pontifical Biblical. And as you see, we are very happy, maybe it will work, Steve Mason will join us and say a few introductory words. Please, welcome.
Okay. Well, good morning, Rome. I'm sorry that I can't be with you. I am with you in spirit watching on live stream. I very much enjoyed Craig's lecture. I have two things just now to say before the talk that will be presented on my behalf. I must thank, first of all, Joseph Sievers for his constant support during this ridiculous foot injury that prevents me from being there. Then to Kelly Bauch for stepping in at the very last minute to read my paper to you. And to Daniel, who is called Daniel, I don't know his last name, for matching up the text with the PowerPoint. So thanks sincerely to all of you. Second, I want to say how delighted I was by the invitation, because it brings me back to something I haven't really looked at since my dissertation 30 years ago, Josephus' Pharisees. I have worked a little bit on Josephus in the intervening decades, but not on the Pharisees. And I can hear you, see you, asking the screen, Steve, how is it possible that you have worked on Josephus and not really worked on the Pharisees? And the answer to that question, my friends, you are about to hear from Kelly. Talk to you soon.
One reason I'm grateful to share in this wonderful conference is that it allows me to return to a subject I haven't considered much since PhD student days, when I wrote my dissertation on the Pharisees in the works of Josephus. In the intervening decades, I have worked on Josephus, but the Pharisees rarely come up. That observation provides a departure point for any study of Josephus' Pharisees, which is that they play no significant role in his works. We shall discuss the reasons, but let us first pause to fully take in this evidential fact, because it has often been missed in scholarship that no matter what one makes of Josephus' Pharisees, they were not germane to his literary purposes. Even attentive ancient audiences, that is, might well have overlooked them altogether when hearing Josephus' main compositions. Because modern scholars are intently interested in the Pharisees, it does not follow that Josephus shared our interest or that he can posthumously be compelled to cough up what he knew about the group when he himself chose to say so little. To be more concrete, Pharisees do not appear in the main sections of his three works. In War, which recounts the events that led to Jerusalem's destruction, Pharisees act only in the opening volume, establishing a context in the preceding 2 centuries, and once in a passing phrase in Book 2. That is it. In the Antiquities, Josephus' thematic interest is in the Judeans' ancient constitution and its historical outworking, the explication of which occupies the first 11, or at a stretch 12 volumes. The Pharisees are nowhere to be seen. They act at certain moments only in the post-biblical part of Antiquities, which scholars have usually seen as hodgepodge of disparate material. One could argue, of course, that Josephus doesn't mention Pharisees in the biblical period because they weren't around yet. But he does mention other later individuals, groups, and circumstances he thought important, including the Romans, Claudius, Vespasian, Epicureans, and various authors. If the Pharisees' interpretation of Moses' law had really mattered to him, he missed 1,000 opportunities to say so. In any case, the fact is that they do not appear in the trunk of his longest work on the Judean constitution. That he did not consider them important for his foreign audiences is confirmed by his last main composition, the Against Appian. In celebrating the heart and soul of Judean law and culture there, he finds no reason to mention Pharisees. There is more. The Pharisees' presence in Josephus looks even slighter when we realize that the passages fall into two distinct categories. He describes Pharisees most fully when he's contrasting them with other Judean parties or schools. In his 30 Greek volumes, only in 10 places does he narrate some action by Pharisees, and most of these are single-sentence references at most. So now we turn to Josephus' Pharisees, the text, the Judean War. The prologue to Josephus' War presents a vivid and plausible situation. Josephus is in Rome as the Emperor Vespasian and Titus are basking in a decade-long celebration of their victory in Judea. Predictably, a small army of would-be historians has rushed into producing accounts that try to outdo each other in flattering the new rulers. Josephus apparently hears these works in progress, recited by their authors, for he uses the present tense. He makes the charge, however, that the writers in question either had never set foot in Judea, or had no idea of what really happened, or they had some knowledge but buried it in these fawning propaganda pieces. As a proud priest aristocrat from Jerusalem, who knows both sides of the conflict by the hardest possible path, first fighting against Vespasian in his toughest conflict before Jerusalem, then spending the bulk of the war among the Romans by necessity, Josephus is in a unique position to give the truthful and balanced account that history requires. Three primary themes of his narrative, correcting what the triumphalists are saying, are already clear in his prologue. Whereas the Flavian historians miss no opportunity to humiliate and denigrate the Judeans, that approach minimizes the Flavian achievement. In fact, Judean men, he writes, almost exclusively about men, have an innate masculine virtue. They are incredibly tough and brave and hold death in contempt. So much so that Vespasian sees the need to train his legionnaires, especially for the anticipated conflict in Jerusalem. Man for man, the famous legionaries are no match for Judeans, but frequently run away from them in fear. Jerusalem was not conquered by the Flavians as current propaganda would have it. It was conquered 130 years earlier by Pompey the Great, a story that Josephus relates. Not only that, but Jerusalem flourished under Roman rule through the intervening decades, reaching the height of prosperity and happiness. Its success began with the Hasmonean dynasty, which had the wisdom to make alliances with Rome from the start, and was best embodied by the world-famous King Herod, a close friend of the model Emperor Augustus, secondarily with some of Herod's successors. Josephus devotes the double-sized Book 1 mainly to Herod's rise and rule with Roman support, and Book 2 to how the final catastrophe began, only late in the hated Nero's reign. Jerusalem's story is a tragic one in the classical sense. That is, its leaders and people have behaved like those of any other polis in facing challenges and reversals of fortune while disputing the best way forward. Usually, the younger hotheads prefer a more vigorous response to insult and injury, while the wiser elders counsel restraint for the sake of long-term well-being. This is normal and Polybian in its cast. But somewhat as Polybius, Corinth made tragic mistakes in protecting its interests, Jerusalem fell into a perfect storm of provocation by Nero's late procurators, met by increasing vigorous factionalism. How do the Pharisees help this narrative along? They're absent from the main story, as we have seen, but show up in 4 preliminary scene-setting junctures. First, they play a crucial role in the downfall of the Hasmonean dynasty. Josephus presents this as a matter of fortune reversal. That is, the Hasmoneans steadily gained in power and virtue until John Hyrcanus, whose 31-year rule testified to his excellence. But he was so close to the deity that he was also permitted to see the precipitous decline that two of his sons would bring. The first son, Aristobulus, quickly died in physical and psychic torment after killing his brother. The second, Alexander Jannaeus, ruled much longer, but as a brutal tyrant, murdering tens of thousands of his Judean subjects with the help of mercenary soldiers. His most extreme act of impiety was to have 800 of his enemies crucified while their wives and children were killed in front of them. The Pharisees' first appearance in Josephus' corpus comes just after Alexander dies and bequeaths the kingdom to his wife Alexandra. He is sure that she will win the people's respect because she is somehow well known for her piety, devotion to ancestral custom, and opposition to his crimes. It was her piety, Josephus says, that led her to promote the Pharisees. Josephus' opening description of the group is important because it contains the seeds of many things he will repeat about them later. Quote now, symbiotically with her, the Pharisees now grow into power, a certain body of Judeans reputed to be more pious than others and to interpret the laws more precisely, carefully. Being actually pious toward the deity herself, she deferred to them rather too much, and they, by gradually exploiting the woman's simplicity, became the true managers of state affairs, able to drive out or bring down whomever they wished, to release or to put in chains. She ruled others, but the Pharisees ruled her. They launch a purge against her late husband's accomplices and younger son, Aristobulus II, killing many and prompting Aristobulus to contend for the high priesthood against his older brother, Hyrcanus II, a squabble that would bring in the Romans and end Judean self-rule. Although this episode has little explicit consequence, in the sense that Josephus will find little reason to describe the Pharisees again, it sets the scene for two incidental references to the Pharisees. Evidently, Alexandra's reign gave them a position of popular prominence as effective advocates of the people against powerful rulers, which they do not lose. So it is that when Josephus describes King Herod's reversal of fortune, the Pharisees reappear quite incidentally, but as evidently as influential. Claiming that a cabal of women around Herod caused all his problems, partly because they conspired to see their own male favorites on the throne, Josephus describes a major conspiracy led by the unnamed wife of his brother, Pherosus I. Among the charges against her is the claim that she paid the Pharisees compensation when they opposed him. This is a cryptic notice, but consistent with the fuller introduction of Pharisees under Alexandra. In the war, Herod comes off as a virtuous and pious ruler who did great things for Jerusalem as Augustus' ally. The Pharisees are clearly among the troublemakers here, engaged in sordid behavior as far as the ruler is concerned. They will appear only once again as actors in Josephus' war, although the assumption remains that they are influential players. This mention comes in the famous passage describing the fateful decision of some younger priest led by the temple commandant, Eleazar, son of Ananias, to close off Jerusalem's temple to foreign gifts and sacrifices. Josephus first remarks that the chief priest and the notables together urged the other priests, backed by popular insurgents, at least not to stop the customary sacrifice for the rulers. When the priests refused to listen, he continues, 3 leadership groups come together for consultation: the most powerful men, the chief priest, and the notables of the Pharisees, all urging the people that cutting off communication with other nations would be a major rupture with Judean tradition. It's not clear whether mention of the Pharisees at 2:411 is merely an elaboration of the chief priest and notables already indicated in 2:410, but whether it suggests a new effort to reach out to Pharisees in the hope of presenting a broad front. Either way, it's clear that the Pharisees had notable figures involved in high political affairs. These are the only actions of the Pharisees described in war. The most famous passage in the work that mentions them is of a different kind. As Josephus describes the transition from native rule with the removal of Herod's son Archelaus from Jerusalem in 6 CE, he briefly mentions the unrest that occurred at the time, led by Judas the Galilean. Calling Judas a sophist who led a school or faction with no relation to the others, Josephus invents an opportunity to break away from grubby politics after the merest hint of unrest to the sublime heights of philosophy. Judeans have 3 schools of philosophy, he explains: Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. Although he puts the Pharisees first and the Essenes last, his obvious forriba is with the Essenes, who have appeared admiringly in the text already, and now occupy nearly all of the digression. An ancient reader had to assume that if Josephus favored any of the schools, it was the Essenes. This is not least because he says, in a string of adulatory comments about them, that their views of the soul and afterlife are an irresistible bait for those who have once tasted of their wisdom. Given Josephus' clear love of the Essenes, why does his opening sentence put them last and mention the Pharisees first? The answer may come when he gets around to the Pharisees and Sadducees at the tail end of this digression. Returning to the first 2 schools mentioned, he speaks of the Pharisees according to all known manuscripts as ten protein apagontes harese. First here could mean one or more of 3 things: the oldest, the leading, or simply the first mentioned of the 2. The third option is the simplest in structural terms, but it would not explain why he named them first from the outset. The second explanation is possible, but his audience would have no basis for taking first as oldest without further explanation, which he could easily have given. The verb apago is also curious because it usually has a negative sense of leading away or astray, which is why scholars have conjectured a more satisfactory epago, perhaps meaning simply constitute. However that may be, the overall impression is that in spite of Josephus' clear attraction to the Essenes, the Pharisees have managed to position themselves at the top as first of the schools. For the rest, after a brief reminder from the story of Queen Alexandra that the Pharisees have the reputation of interpreting the legal ordinances with precision, Josephus gives equally short shrift to the Pharisees and Sadducees. In sharp contrast to the Essenes, who soar by themselves, Josephus reduces these 2 to a formulaic opposition reminiscent of passages of Cicero and Tacitus. Pharisees affirm what Sadducees deny. They ascribe everything to fate, even if doing right and wrong is also a free choice. Consider the soul imperishable, with rewards and punishments awaiting after death, and have a community in which members care for each other. Sadducees deny both the soul and fate, and treat even fellow Sadducees harshly. Now we turn to Judean antiquities. Space does not permit us to go through the fuller episodes involving Pharisees in the later volumes of the Antiquities in the same level of detail. Fortunately, I do not think that we need to do so. Although the episodes are both more numerous and fuller, they basically expand what Josephus has said already in War. He stresses this by repeatedly referring Antiquities readers to specifically Book 2 of the War for what he calls a more precise account of the 3 schools. We have seen that Josephus gives Antiquities a very different focus from War, namely the ancient Jewish constitution, to prove the claim that those who follow Moses' law prosper, whereas those who violate them, since they embody the divine laws of nature, come to miserable ends. To make his new points, or sometimes only to be interesting perhaps, he often changes the coloring of his portraits of key figures, most notably King Herod, about whom many more negative things are said. But the 3 schools have a remarkably similar function in the story, as background. Only the Essenes come out with their uniformly positive press. The Pharisees and Sadducees are part of the political furniture. Their roles are clarified somewhat, but not noticeably changed. We must remember that Antiquities 13 through 20 turns the material of War I and the early part of Book 2 into 8 volumes, giving Josephus roughly 3 times as much space for the same period. Naturally, his accounts are fuller and offer some new angles, but on the 3 schools, they are broadly consistent with war, as he stresses. Certainly, they do not support the old view that Antiquities mentions the Pharisees more often in order to flatter them, or through them, the rabbinic movement. Book 13 has the most additions. For example, it adds a brief Ciceronian notice about the 3 views of fate and free will held by the schools as a break from the narrative of Jonathan the Hasmonean. While referring to War II for detail, Josephus quietly changes the scheme to have the Essenes rather than the Pharisees occupy the all-fate pole, opposite from the no-fate Sadducees, leaving the Pharisees to bring up the meaningless middle position in this arrangement. Then, whereas war introduced the Pharisees when describing Alexandra's embrace of them, Antiquities provides a fascinating backstory. We now learn that John Hyrcanus has been a disciple of the Pharisees 2 generations earlier, fell out with them, and set aside the Pharisee system of legal interpretation. This means that Alexandra's embrace of the Pharisees, perhaps 30 years later, marks a return to the earlier situation of Pharisaic predominance in legal interpretation, which thereafter becomes normal in Judea. But why did John fall out with them? Josephus gives 2 explanations within the same story. First, after recounting his hero's divinely favored exploits, he remarks ominously, "As for Hyrcanus, his own success and that of his sons aroused jealousy among the Judeans." The Pharisees, who are one of the Judean schools, as we have explained above, were especially hostile toward him. Their power with the populace is such that even when they speak against a king or against a high priest, they are immediately credited. The explanatory story he attaches does not quite match the headline, however. The story is that John throws a banquet to which he invites leading Pharisees, Sadducees, and apparently others. He takes the opportunity to reassert his commitment to Pharisaic rigor and asks them to be sure to tell him if he goes astray. They all praise his piety, but another dinner guest stands up and brazenly demands that John relinquish the high priesthood on the ground that he is likely an illegitimate child, because they have heard that his mother was once held prisoner by a Seleucid force, hence presumably raped. Josephus claims that all the Pharisees were indignant with this impudent man, but a Sadducee friend of John saw an opportunity here. He advised the ruler that the Pharisees secretly agreed with the man's outburst, and that the way to prove that was to ask them what punishment the man deserved. Here's the passage. When Hyrcanus asked the Pharisees what they considered a worthy punishment, for he would be persuaded that the slanders had not been made with their approval, he said if they advocated punishing Eleazar with a commensurate penalty, they proposed lashes and chains, for it did not seem right to punish someone with death on account of verbal abuse, and, in any case, the Pharisees are naturally merciful in the matter of punishments. At this response, Hyrcanus became very angry and assumed that the man had slandered him with their approval. Jonathan the Sadducee exacerbated his anger greatly and achieved the following result. He induced Hyrcanus to join the party of the Sadducees, to abandon the Pharisees, to repeal the ordinances that they had established among the people, and to punish those who observed these ordinances. This is the reason, then, that hatred developed among the populace toward him and his sons. This is an extremely important passage for historians, whether his ancient audience would have picked up on it or not, because it reflects his view that the problems that came after John especially with Alexander Jannaeus' long reign of about 28 years, were caused by popular hatred because of the Hasmonean break with Pharisaic legal interpretation. Moreover, it gives a clear reason, namely the Sadducees took a much harsher line with punishments. Josephus realizes that his Gentile audiences might wish a fuller explanation of this bond between Pharisees and common people, and now for the first time he adds a crucial piece of information. I want to explain here that the Pharisees passed on to the people certain ordinances from a succession of fathers which are not written down in the laws of Moses. For this reason, they are not in Moses' law, the party of the Sadducees dismisses these ordinances, averring that one need recognize only the written ordinances, Moses' law, whereas those from the tradition of the fathers need not be observed. Conflicts and major differences develop between the two groups over these matters. The Sadducees find their followers only among the wealthy, however, and have no popular following, whereas the Pharisees have the support of the populace. But these two groups, and also the Essenes, have been described with detailed accuracy in the second book of My Judaica. From all this, it appears that the Pharisees' parabiblical tradition of legal interpretation is responsible for ameliorating the potentially harsh prescriptions in Moses' law, especially the application of the death penalty. It is worth stressing that the Pharisees' tradition from their fathers is not, or not yet, the rabbinic Torah shebe'al peh, the oral Torah from Sinai mentioned in Mishneh Avot. This is explicitly an interpretive tradition. In case it should seem obvious that Josephus is praising the Pharisees for being on the side of the people and practicing leniency, notice 4 things that point clearly in the opposite direction. First, recall that he frames the story by blaming the Pharisees for the break with his hero John, out of jealousy at his success and using their popular influence to harm him. Second, Josephus is not Democrat, but a proud aristocrat who frequently laments the gullibility of the masses and their vulnerability to demagogues and panderers. Third, he speaks only, often, and enthusiastically of the laws of Moses as a complete and perfect constitution, which needs no supplement or special interpretive tradition. In his extensive representations of Moses' law, accordingly, he never once mentions a special interpretive tradition. Fourth, far from trying to ameliorate the law's potential harshness, Josephus boasts about their uncompromising severity. In the last quarter of the Appian, where he reaches a rhetorical crescendo in praise of Moses' law, their uncompromising severity is the cornerstone of his case. Other legislatures he mocks first find all kinds of ways to mitigate the severity of their laws, imposing monetary fines, for example. Judeans, by contrast, demand the death penalty for a wide range of crimes, including adultery and fraudulent business dealings, without the possibility of amelioration. A striking example of that is the rebellious youth. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 18 through 21, permits a persistently rebellious son to be hauled by his father before the city elders and stoned to death. As Louis Feldman observes, the rabbis would later qualify this law in so many ways that they rendered it effectively unenforceable. They carefully exegeted the text in such a way that the provision concerned only boys in a 3-month period of pubescence who had managed to show themselves gluttons and drunkards during that time. The specific criterion for finding these crimes was that they consumed food belonging to others in a public place before witnesses. Moreover, both mother and father had to desire the boy's death, and both of them had to be in perfect health when they made this decision. And even if all these conditions were met, stoning itself did not simply follow. The parents had first to beat the boy in the presence of 3 judges, and only if he repeated the same offense while still in that narrow age bracket could they bring him to trial before the court of 23 needed for capital cases. Finally, the court had to make its own assessment. In this way, extremely precise exegesis of the laws ensured both that the law remained honored in principle and that no youth was likely to be executed under its provisions. Whatever status this law had in real-life Jerusalem, Josephus not only fails to suggest any such mitigations, on the contrary, he seizes this law and writes it as a shining example of the Judean constitution's unique, unapologetic, and inexorable severity of a kind that no other society had the resolve to pursue. He even extends the law to include sons and daughters without age restrictions. Josephus' addition to his biblical source go in the opposite direction from rabbinic exegesis, highlighting instead the threat to the moral order that a rebellious child presents. The youth has a chance to repent, but if he persists, he must face execution. This is no aberration in the Antiquities. In the Appian, which selects only a few items to illustrate the admirable severity of Judean law, Josephus invokes this example again, putting it bluntly: honor of parents, the law puts in second place only after honoring God. The one who does not fully reciprocate the favors received from them, but falls short in any way, it, that is the law, delivers up to be stoned. This fits with the Appian's larger claim that Judeans were not mentioned by early Greek authors, even if they were around long before the Greeks, because they do not seek to mix with other nations and thus allow their divine laws to be diluted by human weakness. Back in Antiquities 13, then, Josephus linked notices about the Pharisees' leniency in punishment on account of their special interpretive tradition, and their resulting popularity with the masses are not signs of his esteem for the group. Josephus clearly makes them culprits of the public hostility that arose against his favorite ruler, John Hyrcanus. Even though the story he tells puts the blame on the conniving Sadducee Jonathan. The Pharisee-led popular opposition begins only when John abandons the Pharisees' legal system. This popular unrest will dog his sons, Aristobulus, and especially Alexander Jannaeus. Antiquities' account thus gives a much fuller context to Queen Alexandra's rapprochement with the Pharisees, briefly narrated in War I. In this version, however, she can no longer be naively duped by them because of her piety and their reputation for piety. Since they have been on the scene for a couple of generations and been persistent agitators against her predecessors, her embrace of the Pharisees now appears as a very deliberate, rather Machiavellian move to stabilize her power. Her dying husband advises her to reinstate the Pharisees as a way of mollifying the populace, which had opposed him relentlessly, and she eagerly agrees. And then he said, on her return to Jerusalem, as though from a splendid victory, she should yield a certain amount of power to the Pharisees, for if they praised her in return for this sign of regard, they would dispose the nation favorably toward her. These men, he assured her, had so much influence with their fellow Jews that they could injure those whom they hated and help those to whom they were friendly. For they had the complete confidence of the masses when they spoke harshly of any person, even when they did so out of envy. And he himself, he added, had come into conflict with the nation because these men had been badly treated by him. Only now we learn, incidentally, that Alexander's most conspicuous opponents, and hence victims, had been Pharisees. Since that conflict had created persistent unrest, it was an obvious political move for Alexandra to conciliate them. Here we see one of the many indications that Josephus already knew this fuller story when he wrote War, but truncated it there for limited space. War I, 109, related that Alexandra made her older son, Hyrcanus, the high priest, not only because of his age, but mainly because of his lack of interest in public affairs. In the context, this could sound odd unless one inferred that she needed a high priest who would leave her free hand as queen, Antiquities adjusts the pieces to make it clear that Alexandra had to choose between a daring and energetic son, Aristobulus, who would champion his late father's causes, and an older son whose lack of interest or energy for public affairs would keep him out of the program of power sharing with the Pharisees. This is an important juncture in the narrative because Alexandra reinstates the legal judiciary norms of the Pharisees. She appointed Hyrcanus high priest because of his seniority, but much more because of his lack of energy. She allowed the Pharisees to do everything and instructed the populace to obey them, and anything in the legal system that her father-in-law Hyrcanus had abrogated of what the Pharisees had introduced from their ancestral tradition, this she put back into operation. So go ahead. So in the interest of time, I think we are moving forward. Okay. The last work of Josephus that mentions Pharisees is his Autobiography. This work adds no information about what Pharisees believe, but it does confirm their involvement in Jerusalem's leadership, and it may even give us clues about why Josephus had such a dim view of the Pharisees' troublesome nature. There are two passages to consider. In the first, Josephus describes his own youth and education. He writes as follows: "When I was about 16 years old, I chose to gain expertise in the philosophical schools among us. There are three of these, as we have often said, the first Pharisees, the second Sadducees, and the third Essenes. In this way, I intend to choose the best, if I might examine them all. So I toughened myself, and after considerable effort, passed through the three of them. Yet I did not regard even the resulting expertise sufficient for me. When I discovered that a certain man by the name of Banus made his life in the desert, I became his devotee, wearing clothes made from trees, scavenging food that grew by itself, and washing frequently for purification with frigid water day and night. When I had lived with him 3 years and so satisfied my longing, I returned to the city. Being now in my 19th year, I began to involve myself in public life, deferring to the philosophical school of the Pharisees, which is quite like the one called Stoic among the Greeks. And I think we're turning now to conclusions. Is this correct? Okay. If Josephus' audience remembered any of the three schools, none of which plays a role in the core material of war, Antiquities, or Appian, it would have been the Essenes, whom he may have also heard about otherwise. They are the only Judean group mentioned by Philo or Pliny the Elder, or later Porphyry. Josephus gives them the fullest and most consistently admiring attention. Pharisees are not primary in any of his works. Nevertheless, we are perfectly entitled to scrutinize Josephus' works for what he does say about the Pharisees. These passages turn out to be strikingly consistent from their first appearance in War's account of Queen Alexandra. The much larger space available in Jewish Antiquities 13 through 20 allows Josephus to explain things he omitted in the Bellum, helping us to make better sense of that primary story. The metaphysical positions that Josephus attributes to the Pharisees on the soul, afterlife, and fate versus free will are both vague with respect to the new and different body inhabited by the good souls, and slippery as to whether the Pharisees attribute only some things to fate or everything, but only in a certain sense. This is as it should be with such questions, and we find much the same in other writers. Unmistakably clear is that Josephus agrees with Pharisees, Essenes, and all right-thinking people as he sees it, in utterly rejecting views held by the Judeans' answer to the Epicureans in these matters, the Sadducees, who think that the soul dies with the body and that no higher power cares about your affairs. If Josephus does not make the connection between belief in afterlife and the Pharisees' recognition of a living interpretive tradition alongside Scripture, as many scholars have done, suggesting that Sadducees did not believe in resurrection because it is a post-biblical development, that is likely because he and the Essenes believed these things without the help of Pharisaic tradition. He does, however, bring 4 points into such close contact as to suggest that they are related to each other, namely the Pharisees' extra-biblical interpretive tradition, the reputation for or pretension to extremely precise or distinction-making interpretation of the laws, their leniency in the matter of legal punishments, and their continuing popularity with the masses, such that Judea's legal system has to follow Pharisaic principles, and leading Pharisees' work alongside the chief priests and political leadership. Josephus does not explain the connections, but they're not hard to imagine. The common folk were, in ancient societies, those most likely to be hauled before courts for such common crimes as insulting parents, theft, robbery, rape, assault, and Sabbath violation, for most of which the Torah prescribes the death penalty, and so would benefit most from a sophisticated interpretation of an ancient legal code that on its face could spell out dire penalties. This means that Josephus' Pharisees were legalists in the sense that they were legal experts who insisted that precise interpretation of the laws be followed. But they seem to have done this much in the way that a good defense lawyer would, to say that you can only be charged with violating certain laws under very specific conditions. Finally, Josephus' disdain for the Pharisees has two fairly clear motives. First, he prides himself on being an expert interpreter of the laws, but ties this unmistakably to his priestly identity and education. Second, his initially ambiguous comments about the Pharisees' reputation for precision in interpreting the laws is usually followed by a story that makes them look rather self-serving and manipulative because of their popular image. The crowning example and the simplest explanation for his antipathy is the work of prominent Pharisees to have him, a priest appointed by chief priest, removed from his position of leadership in the Galilee. As an addendum to these conclusions, I'd like to briefly suggest points of comparison and contrast between Josephus' Pharisees and those of other Greek sources, which all happen to be in the New Testament. To begin with, they agree on the Pharisees' great influence and prominence among the Judeans, on the Pharisees' distinctive exegetical tradition and legal expertise, and on the Pharisees' belief against the Sadducees in a life to come, simply called resurrection in the New Testament texts. In terms of attitude toward the group, however, the New Testament texts differ markedly. To put it simply, Mark, Matthew, and John, in their different ways, all present the Pharisees as lethally opposed to Jesus. Their legal expertise is oppressive in demanding his compliance, and he and they mutually reject each other's authority. Luke Acts gives a completely different view. Far from trying to harm Jesus, the Pharisees keep inviting him to dinners, even though he is a terrible guest who keeps criticizing them. They nevertheless recognize and respect him as a teacher, warn him to leave Galilee, to escape Herod Antipas, and accompany him as he enters Jerusalem. Crucially, they fade from the scene when the Sadducean temple authorities detain and execute Jesus, having no share in his execution, contrary to Mark and Matthew. And they reappear in Acts as advocates of tolerance toward the Christians, later as Christian converts in large numbers. The paradoxical consequence is that this two-volume Christian work is decidedly more favorable toward the Pharisees than it is toward the Judean priest Josephus. The reason is not difficult to see, as both Jesus and the Pharisees work among and for the common people, distinguishing themselves sharply from the temple-based priestly authorities. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for Kelly for reading the paper. We will have time only for one question, so if someone has a nice question to address to Steve, he can answer it.
Hi.
A two-part question, Steve. One about Salome Alexandria. Her brother Shimon, at least in other sources, rabbinic sources, plays a major role in the accommodation to Pharisaic rule, and you don't mention those sources. I wonder how you tie them in. And secondly, about, if I may disagree about Galilee, Sepphoris, of course, joins in the opposition to the war, and Emperor Nero, of course, honors the city with renaming it Iranopolis and allowing it to coin names with that epithet.
I'm very sorry, but there's some kind of sound interference here. I'm really sorry, but I didn't hear the questions precisely. I heard something. I heard something about Galilee and Sepphoris.
He will come here and talk to the computer. So.
Okay. Yep. Hello, Eric.
Hi, Steve. Two-part question. One, you mentioned the struggle or caving into the Pharisees, in the time of Queen Alexandria, Salome Alexandria, and I was wondering where her brother fits into this, Shimon ben Shattach, who in rabbinic sources plays a major role in bringing in the Pharisees in a very positive way, as I understand it. And secondly,
Sure.
mentioning Sepphoris in Galilee is a big supporter of opposing the war, and Emperor Nero honored the city, renaming it City of Peace and allowing it to mint coins with that name.
Yeah. Thank you. Very quickly, Josephus says nothing about Shimon ben Shattach. And so my goal here was simply to try to understand his narrative. That is, his biases, his perspective on Pharisees. And I'm simply trying to say that from his angle, he disdains the Pharisees. He's an aristocrat, a priest. But this doesn't mean they should be disdained. Kelly was not able to read the whole paper, but I tried to stress there in the end, for example, that you can understand his antipathy toward the Pharisees because they are on the side of the people, and they have legislation that actually makes the law livable and so on. So I don't think Josephus's view should hold any particular weight. It's just that we should try to understand it, and he doesn't mention Shimon. Sepphoris, yes, exactly, very important, and of course he has matching information that the Sephorites were forbidden to participate in Jerusalem's conflict, for example, with the procurator. Yes, all of that is there, but that doesn't really come up in the Pharisee passages in Josephus' life. Yeah.